Welcome to the Volunteer Recruitment Planning webinar. My name is Rebecca Ringe. I'm the National Provider Manager at Good Shepherd Microfinance. I love working with volunteers, and in my background I've worked with volunteers across a few roles, including in Western Australia. I managed the State Emergency Services Program for Red Cross, and through that role I managed 600 volunteers across the state who responded during times of emergency. I've also managed the volunteer program at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre in Melbourne. That was a really large volunteer program as well. We had about 40 paid staff, but we had over 900 volunteers who were working across 25 different programs. This webinar should take you approximately 20 minutes to complete. It is the first in a two-part series. What we're focusing on in this webinar is looking at the motivations and barriers for volunteers, and what we'll also do is identify and develop what your organisation's volunteers might be and what possible roles might come from that. Over the next two slides we'll be looking at why people volunteer and what the barriers are to volunteering. It's important to think about and understand these so that you can try and address these motivations and barriers when you're actually designing your volunteer program and your volunteer roles. So in terms of why people volunteer, I'd like you at this point to think about have you ever volunteered before, or have you ever wanted to? And I'd like you to take a moment and pause the presentation and just write down a few points about why you volunteered. What were your reasons? Some of the common reasons that people give for wanting to volunteer is that they want to give something back. For some people, it's important for them to be able to be gaining new skills and experience, and that might be either just purely for interest's sake, or it may be as a way for them to gain skills to help them find employment. Many people enjoy the social aspect of volunteering. I know for myself, my first volunteering role was with the Red Cross, and it was in a soup patrol van, and the reason that I did that really was because I got to hang out with my friends. It was when I was younger. Some people want to volunteer because they want to be active. It can provide a bit of structure to their life as well, particularly if it's a role that is a regular, ongoing, kind of steady role. People may be very passionate about a cause, and certainly that's what I found at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. The main motivation for people volunteering is that they were very passionate about supporting asylum seekers in Australia. People want to contribute in a meaningful way, so they may not feel that they're getting that elsewhere in their life. So for some people, volunteering is a way that they can actually feel like they're doing something meaningful and contributing. And for other people, it may be as simple as they are required to volunteer to receive Centrelink payments, or it might be that they're working off fines. There's a whole range of reasons that people do volunteer. Now, if we think about the barriers to volunteering, again, I'd like you to think about if you've ever wanted to volunteer, but it hasn't happened, and why not? I know for me, particularly over the last 2 years, I've had a very busy job that has required a lot of my attention, and the volunteer roles that I've been interested in doing have been during business hours. So it's been difficult for me to find something that suits me over the last 2 years. So at this point, again, I'd like you to just pause the presentation and just write down some of the reasons that in the past that you, or currently, that you have wanted to volunteer, but it just hasn't happened for you. So for many people, and this is something that probably resonates with you as well, is just not having enough time. So this is a pretty common challenge, I think, in this day and age. Some people are not able to make a long-term commitment, and some roles do require that. Some people are just not interested in volunteering or not interested in particular roles. For some people, they can't afford it, so this is something to be cognizant of when you're designing your roles, is making sure there isn't a cost to the volunteer, and if there are any costs incurred, that they're able to be reimbursed for that. Some people have had bad previous experiences. Now the next two are fairly common, which is that people don't know how to become involved and no one has asked them. So they're fairly straightforward things, I think, that you can address. In terms of not knowing how to become involved, I think that's something that we'll be looking at during the second webinar that we'll be doing with volunteer recruitment and management, is making it really easy and really obvious and being out there to let people know how they can become involved. And in terms of no one asking me, that's one to think about with your current organisation and your staff or existing volunteers, is actually getting them to ask the people that they know. And some people feel that they don't necessarily have the skills to do the job, so they're uncertain about that, or they're not able to find a role that matches their skills. Before you recruit, it's important that you have established a framework and policies and procedures for a volunteer program. So I'm assuming that that is already set up for your organisation. If not, you probably want to check out the national standards for volunteer involvement. It includes things like risk management, policies, workplace safety, organisational commitment. What it does is it looks at what you need to provide a framework for a volunteer program, and it really is important that volunteer programs are supported by all levels within the organisation, including the board and your CEO or management. And volunteer programs work best if you have a culture and a structure that supports and values volunteers. So it's really important that this stuff is in place and set up before you start actually recruiting or getting in volunteers. So next you need to look at what will the volunteer actually do. So over the next few slides we'll look at information that will help you plan possible roles and structure the role and develop a position description. So the first thing you've got to do is identify the actual role that you want the volunteer to do. So for example, we might want a volunteer to come in to help develop a client survey. So the next step is actually identifying the tasks that would be involved in that role. So for this example, you'd want the volunteer to identify what you want to measure, choose a survey method, design the questions, undertake the survey, collect the results and write the report. So they're the kind of overview tasks that would be involved in this particular role. The next thing to look at is what kind of skills and experience or qualifications do they need. So you'd need to actually identify the skills necessary to perform each individual role. So for this example, looking at developing client surveys, the kinds of skills and experience that you might be looking for are report writing skills. You might be looking for someone that has a knowledge or experience of different survey methodology and tools that you can use for surveys, and also an ability to interact with a range of people. I'd say that last one is probably a fairly common one for a lot of roles, particularly because they're going to have to interact with people within your organisation, but if they are interacting with the public, then that's a kind of a key skill that they would need. Next thing to look at is actually how the role is structured. So you need to think about the hours and days that people would need to do. So can you be flexible with this depending on the role? Can you have roles that are available during school hours? Can you have roles that, it doesn't really matter when they do the work, it just needs to be, for example, 10 hours a month? Or does that particular role need someone who can come in regularly every Monday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. In terms of the location, is it something where people need to be physically in the office, or is it something that they can do off-site? Can they work from home? Could you have a loan assessment committee that is a virtual loan assessment committee, so it does, it does things via email? In terms of the time frame for the role, is it an ongoing role? Is it something that needs to be done regularly? Or could it be structured as a project role? So a time-limited project that has a beginning and an end to that. And that one is probably particularly relevant and interesting for people that might be time poor, that might have just a period of time, say, university holidays, or for corporate volunteers. Corporate volunteers are a really fantastic and increasing possibility for volunteer programs, but often they are constrained by, the fact that they are working, often full-time. So, are there ways that you can actually, create project-type roles that can engage them? And you might have special requirements for the role, such as, access to particular software. So when you're looking at structuring the role, I'd like you to think back to the barriers that we identified, and when you're looking at the structure, think about how you can address some of those barriers. So some of it might be around, people being flexible about people being able to work off-site rather than having to come in, being flexible with the hours that you can do, or, as I said, framing things in a project way rather than having them as ongoing. It doesn't mean that all of your roles are going to be able to be flexible, but if you are really looking at expanding and adding value, you'll be thinking, again, outside the square. So not necessarily for roles that are just things that can be done during business hours and that are not flexible. What are the ways and options that you've got to add value through special projects and through engaging people in different ways, such as that project type work? Other things to think about as well are who will the volunteer report to. So it is important that they have a line manager, that they have someone that they can go to for questions and that is overseeing and coordinating them in their work. Also need to think about what training would they need. So for many organisations, and I know this is in my experience, there's often a general induction that might be about the organisation that is standard, that everyone has to do, but then there might be specific training that they need on top of that. Think about where they're going to sit. So this is something that is really important and that can sometimes get overlooked, is that people need to have a space. It might be that you do ask them to bring in their own laptop, and we used to do that because we didn't have enough computers, but they still need somewhere to sit. And they may also need access to your systems. So make sure that kind of stuff is organised and set up before they start. So all of the things that we've just gone through, which is identifying what the role is, identifying the tasks involved, the skills and experience that they need, and the other things within this slide, will all help you structure and then work towards developing a position description. There's lots of examples of position descriptions that you can find online. So I'd suggest, if you don't already have a standard template, have a look on there. And when you're writing the position description, try and think about it as though you know nothing about the role. And if possible, give it to someone who doesn't know anything about the role and see if it makes any sense. Because the PD is a key tool that you have in actually recruiting volunteers and ensuring that they have a bit of an idea and an understanding of what the role is before they actually go through any kind of application process. So that's the end of this webinar. We've identified motivations and barriers, as I said, which are important when you're thinking about how to plan your program. They're important in trying to address some of those barriers when you're designing and structuring roles. And the motivations are particularly important in engagement, which we'll talk about in the next session. We've also looked at possible volunteer roles that could add value to your organisation and how you might structure and plan for those roles. So in the next webinar, we'll look at where you can actually find volunteers, establishing your recruitment and selection process, and then also how you can engage your volunteers once you've got them.